You're listening to the Road to Wisdom podcast, weaving stories told by wonderful minds about all things motherhood, health, intimacy, politics, nature, and everything in between.
Join us on an adventure discovering unique experiences that we can learn from to enhance the ways in which we live.
We are your hosts, Chloe
and Keshia. Hello, Tish. Welcome to the Road to Wisdom podcast. How's it going?
Thank you so much for you both for having me here. Yeah, it's going pretty good. I'm here on Nam. The sun is shining, and for folks that are tuning in, Nam is the Woiwurrung word for Melbourne, and so it's quite beautiful. It's a bit cool, crisp. One of those beautiful autumn mornings.
I actually just learnt what Nam was the other day, and I feel really like I've figured it out.
Like you've upped in your knowledge base.
We were flying. We were at the airport and I had no idea that they acknowledged the names in that way. And I was like, no, where is Nam? Where are all these people going to? And then I realised that it was actually Melbourne and I was like, that's really cool.
Yeah, I'm so all in for that. At our school, the kids they're like learning the Indigenous names of animals, and I'm like, teach me. We didn't get this at school. Teach me, bring it in.
100%. Like, it's so nice to sort of like embed those sort of languages so that everyone sort of knows and familiarizes too. It's been a nice sort of shift from seeing the colonial construct names to the more traditional languages.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. And so I think one of the first things that we should introduce is you, Tish, and what you do and where you come from and your qualifications.
That's the qualifications. I always laugh at that for myself because I'm like, am I? But look, I think importantly, I would like to acknowledge where I am. As a proud Kulkalaig woman, I am a guest, not living on my homelands, so a guest here on Nam. So I would like to acknowledge in my language, Kulalagaya, Kulai Kinailak Esapoiban, Namun Koe Agat, Nud Muruzapu Aimithin, Alak Nalpunka Poiban. Kapu Bailud, Mitamuka Murabuai, A Mura Mubagal Nu, Nuzanel Tish, Nai Kulkalaig, Masignu Napa, Kulkalgal, Zenadth Kesnu, Eso. So, in translation, firstly, I would like to give thanks for island people, we're God-fearing people, so to our Heavenly Father for his blessings upon us. But good morning to everyone tuning in. I'm here on Nam. My name is Tish. I'm a proud Kulkalag woman from the Island of Masig, which is the central island which translates to York Islands, from Kulkalgal Nation, which is the central island group of Zenadth, commonly known as Torres Strait Islands. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Kulin kinship, where I live, work, and meet, and pay my respects to both elders past and present, and our incredible leaders right across our nation, across the communities, and celebrate the incredible spirits and contributions of the many footprints before us in protecting culture, climate, and our community. I guess I get confused sometimes for myself about the label to put on myself because it seems just so like in a box, but I'm a climate advocate. What I do is I help support those communities that are on the front lines of climate impacts, being impacted first and worst, but actually don't contribute to our emissions. And so I support in a campaign called Our Islands Are Home. I have just joined the team at Australian Communities Foundation as their First Nations Program Manager. And that is on the other side of sort of that organizing, campaigning, but fundraising to make sure that these groups that are doing the incredible work, systemic shifting and advocated and building our communities and making sure that they're resourced. But passionate about the ocean and protecting my island communities from sea levels rising. That was kind of a brain dump.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it was good though. And I'd love to talk about quickly to your history, because you have done a lot of work like in marine biology, and then a short stint working for one of the energy companies. So you've got like a really good background to talk to. You've had every single, you've worked in every single aspect of it. So you've seen it all. So I feel like you're very qualified for the job, my love.
No, that's it. I think that's, knowledge is diverse knowledge, comes from different places. And it may seem odd to have gone in the minerals and exploration industry, but, it gave me the experience and knowledge to see like what job transition and bringing those sort of communities and blue collar working, but also saw the ongoing, I guess, degradation and desecration of like country. But we can jump into that later.
Excellent. I think where I would really love to start is acknowledgement, because we do hear everyone is acknowledging country at the moment, which is fantastic. However, because we do hear it so often, and it seems to be on like a recording on the start of lots of podcasts these days, we would love to know. Yeah, I think we'd just love to hear the significance of it. There's a little bit of conflicting information, which I did send you prior to this, and your answer was so beautiful. So, yeah, it would be great to just hear from you on what the significance is, why it is important, and take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great, I think, as we sort of in this sort of like landscape that we're in, and I guess shaping sort of like a lot of once in a generation sort of systemic changes this year, there's a lot of question into how the way that those that are wanting to support First Nations people and their allyship and what that action looks like. And so I think an acknowledgement to country is a really great place to start. It is I guess importantly, acknowledgement to country, I guess it is a term that was first sort of led by the settlers here in Australia to acknowledge pay their respects into moving away from colonial constructs, that how we got to sort of the foundations of how white Australia was made up. Because since sort of colonization, there are inequalities and injustices to sort of how we got here in these modern sort of barriers that we still face today. And it has sort of shaped the way that we've got here. And so in a way for all of us to come together, folks consulted with different traditional groups about how they can, I guess, sort of acknowledge who the first peoples of this country was. And so the acknowledgement to country is a way that for those that weren't originally from here or have blood descendants, they're paying respects to that they still are a part of a system that benefits because they are still living on stolen land. And I think that's where that shift into then what people are identifying what their allyship looks like. I think it's like that true telling of our history, how we got here, and what we sort of need, or what communities and elders are, working towards of treaty processes for sovereignty. And so it is important because it's a sign of respect. But I think it is one also to identify that not everyone, an acknowledgement to country is not a practice that is widely used through the nations right across First Nations group of white Australia. Because we've been homogenized as one group, there have been challenges. And so I think that's one of the barriers that you've sort of shared through, is that you've seen the sort of like tokenistic sort of blackwashing sort of, folks sort of blackwashing their space, sort of, acknowledging, but
Can you
to
just,
country,
sorry,
but there's no
Tish,
sort of,
what do you mean by blackwashing?
That's a really great question, Chloe. So, blackwashing is sort of putting on your platforms the things that you're doing for supporting, whether it's First Nations people of this country, BIPOC communities, or people
signaling.
of colours.
Right. So like when the AFL before a game acknowledges country, is that blackwashing, do you think? Or is that... No?
So I think that's the difference. It's a matter. It's not necessarily blackwashing, because that's a practice that they're implementing exactly to acknowledge. But I guess what's blackwashing is the ongoing racism that happens in that game.
Yeah.
And they don't,
I get you.
Acknowledge that part.
The integrity. There's a whole bit that you're like, hang on, that doesn't really align with what you said at the start.
I've said the acknowledgement to country, but I'm not going to change the way I behave, kind of thing.
Got it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's where what you've sort of identified is that you see a lot of people that are trying to shift, but it's not meaningful. It's not intentional. And they've probably maybe just Googled it and copied and pasted it. But what really are you acknowledging? Yeah. Because we all come from this land and this ocean where genetically we have evolved from it. But for First Nations people and people that identify as Indigenous to their culture have lived with this human nature interaction where we are one, where our stories, our totems, our creation stories are so intertwined and weaved into who we are, into our practices. And so when we say that I acknowledged in my language, but acknowledged and the many footprints before us, and that's a sign that I pay respects to those, standing on the shoulder of giants. Where could I be without those, my ancestors who couldn't fought for the rights before here? And so I guess when, in shifting the way that they're doing it, there's I think it's really important to do it, but I think everyone has their own way of understanding and intentionally acknowledging where they are, where you might be around coastal beautiful country and you see the many beautiful native Banksias and you see how it interconnects so deeply into and shifts from that coastal to like Nightcap National Park, which is sort of this sort of like rainforest type, and it's so lucky, that feeling that you get in your heart, that's what you're acknowledging and that you're grateful, right?
That's
and so it's just about sharing it in your words and deep reflection.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And so I think yeah,
I think
sorry, a lot in there.
No, it was good. It was good. I think correct me if I'm wrong too, because my brains, I do always apologize for the lack of brains that I have. But it kind of stems from, my understanding was that acknowledgement to country also stems from that between mobs and crossing those borders, they would acknowledge that they were no longer on their own country. So could you go into that a little bit more too?
Absolutely. So you are 100% right. It was also acknowledging and crossing over to someone's land was a way of how we were only entering if we were passing through on long journey, to visit family, to maybe even share or trade resources. And so one thing that even now we sort of do in modern times is so while it was sort of coming to the border and they'll have an interaction, sharing, from moving away to nuances today, is that especially for me as a guest here on country, I don't, whether I'm going in a watering hole or a waterfall or down at the beach, I always sort of chuck in a bit of sand or a rock and introduce myself, my intention of why I'm here, and that I know that there is deep history, maybe deep hurt, but maybe deep healing as well, and that I come here with safe space and safe intentions, and that was a way to acknowledge to our spirits that they too then can look after us, because something that we say as First Nations people is that if we look after country, country will look after us. And so we can apply that to sort of the practices in modern day of caring for our country and managing our land better so that we don't have crazy wildfires, or being able to listen to First Nations people and their knowledge about ground, about the way that the land works to avoid sort of maybe floodplain areas. You maybe listen to people because they know where the watering holes are to access, because we're the sunniest, windiest, but driest country and continent in the world. And so we know where to access water and fresh water in our artesian basins. These are some of the things that sort of goes back into that. And so being able to sort of introduce ourselves, share that, we'll be looked after in return.
Yeah, that's beautiful and so amazing. And I'm so glad that we now have a deeper knowledge of that, because I feel like now we can do it from here.
I just want to, excuse me. So as a white person, sometimes I feel like, am I allowed to say these things? Or like, is it my place to say, you know, like acknowledgement to country or to my environment and to my land? Or, you know, like we just bought a property just down the road, and sometimes I'm like, I'd really love to celebrate this space and kind of put it out there that I'm willing to be 100% responsible for this land and regenerate it and look after it and take care of it. Would it be appropriate to have an elder come and kind of just give us that permission? Or, and sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe it's just not my place. Like maybe I'm just not allowed. Maybe I just shouldn't. Do you know what I mean? Would that be?
That's a good question. I like that.
I think it's a really great question, right? Because you're coming in a space where now acknowledging this and wanting to shift your practices in the way that you approach it, understanding that that you're not the first peoples there. You want to respect this space, but I guess those approaches and how to and what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't speak for all different nations, but what I know is that this is something that if it's what's the type of, as an ally and the moment that we're in for sort of these change, what's the type of sort of Australia do you want to live in and raise your young people in? Because there's a lot of change happening right now, and that draws the intersections of like the foundations of colonial history. And so the way that we're doing things is, I think we can only do it together and through power of collaboration and working and learning from those that have cared for country for, over 65,000 years, for millennia. I think you come from the country that you're on, beautiful Bunjalung, has many stories, has many different many different folks and nations. And I think the first step is, wherever you may be, and this is for folks that are tuning in, is that I think understanding who the kinship is in your community, understanding the elders and their families and some of their creation stories down here on it's Bunjul. For me, I come from Marlowe's Law that shape half of Kulkalgal Nation. And so understanding and learning those it's sort of like the rainbow serpent and those stories. And then bringing how then learning, like, what is it that you too then want on your land and the property. Is regeneration and need. Are you wanting to farm on there? Are you wanting to sort of regenerate land? Are you wanting to put, I guess the purpose of that property? And I think it's just sort of then coming together and then I think healing that space, learning from an elder. I think if that's something I think is really special because then it's that kinship together for you between that relationship and that they continue to maybe one day come and visit their land. Maybe they have a story that was there that you can feel proud of knowing and that you can share with the children that they can hear from that. And I think that's really cool. It's a way of, ongoing learning and bringing together those communities.
Yeah, I think it'd be
Sorry,
really...
I don't know if I answered
No,
that.
you
That
did.
was
You did.
I think I've got a question that will kind of lead on to that, and I'm going to put it in frames of how I think about things. So when you go to France or something, you kind of live like you're French, right? You adopt all those cultures, but I feel like here that's not being inherently done. So it would be so nice to with your land be able to adopt the Indigenous culture to look after, work with.
Yeah, and I guess it's a
the
missing
land
piece of the puzzle, right? Because I'm really into like ecology and, understand the concept that what's in my environment is perfect for me to thrive if I harness that in a way. But there's also a big unknowing, and it's like it's not in the textbook of what's available to me. Like I don't have the inherent knowledge to look at my land and go, that I can eat that, or this is how to make, there's bunya nuts here and I can make a cake with this. Like I don't have that knowledge. And so a part of, I think, the missing piece is really connecting with that as well. And I love that opportunity to,
figure out what's an invasive
yeah,
species and what
exactly.
and that's it. And through the introduction of cattle and sheep, through the, in early frontier spaces, it degraded our land and the way that we looked after and managed it. And so there's, I'm not a professional and the best place to speak at it, but there are people that are leading in food sovereignty, like Black Duck Foods, that are working of obviously using reintroducing back kangaroo grass, our native grains. You can see that through chefs using it in their botanicals and stuff like that. But what you just sharing about, you're interested in that ecology. What I'm sort of seeing down here in around the Victorian part is that people with that that don't identify as First Nations are working with sort of First Nations farmers because the equity of accessing that land is a barrier. But what they're doing is working and doing like a market garden and sort of working in a relationship, sort of like small scale like that, that's able to sort of regenerate user practices, support, First Nations. And so I know that like from used to living up that way, there's so many incredible farmers and different types of folks, and maybe there's some First Nations folks out there, and that's something that, potential opportunity. And for folks out there listening.
Yeah.
Anyway.
We should jump into a little bit more about the Northern Rivers and
yes.
Basically a point we've spoken about is that typically up here there's a lot of like everybody's on a healing journey, and there's so many modalities that are rooted in other countries like South America, India, China. And they're kind of like, that's what everybody does. And it's, they're also beautiful as well. But we've talked about what the equivalent would be.
here, because you find all these healing modalities, as you said, and I mean, I feel like at this stage I know so much about South American plants, and I know so much about traditional Chinese medicine, but I don't live in China and I don't live in South America. I live in Australia.
Yeah. So those ecology concepts are kind of out the window when you're like, well, this doesn't even grow in my environment, and yet.
And would it work, if you're taking a plant from South America but taking it on Australian soil, like, does it even work? Like, do you have the same connection to spirit? And so anyway, so I guess the question was, why don't we see that more here, and what can we do to change that?
Or what does it look like? I'd love to just hear about it even. Yeah. I've never had the opportunity to even ask, what would that look like?
I think that's a really good start of, like, I think understanding our ocean and our land is because, like, these practices are the roots from where these nations come from. That was healing that they lived off, and it was, again, that human nature interaction and interconnection that we're so deeply embedded into our land and ocean that these practices are through healing. And so here, a classic example, and most that would probably know, is a smoke ceremony. That is a practice of sort of healing and using, the depending on what nation you come from, but maybe the munga eucalypt leaf that sort of smokes it up, that sort of shares and tells that spirits of that where you come from, and it has those, I guess, those practices in the setting can create those, have those medicinal works. It's that, because our land is our hospital. We get some of these leaves are like soap trees for us, and we can drink Banksias and grab the cordial. But I guess what we don't practice is that we just have a gap of understanding a lot of what those herbs and medicines are, because only elders or those that have walked country really know it and practice it. We've still had barriers to really share it. It's only like we've only been able in this, the last, 6 decades, not even, but being included not from flora and fauna, but also being able to be proud of our identity and our color. And so a lot of this knowledge and these practices are are rooted with sitting down with elders and yarning. And so I guess to answer why we don't see it is because how many people that sit down with elders? How many people do make relationships with First Nations communities that have cared for this, to learn those practices, to walk country? And so, it's why we don't sort of see it and then be able, and then, while we know that our practices and these ancient practices from around the world have these play a certain purpose, they've never been acknowledged, or there's still gaps with acknowledging them in Western science. And so then there are barriers with that. And then some of that science is not told by that person from that nation. It's told by a non-Indigenous or a colonizer person. And so, we have sort of these sort of layers. It's a multifaceted layer of like why we don't see it. But, there are folks, First Nations people, and especially women, matriarchs and healers that are around. And I think being able to, as they continue to learn their practices and sort of intergenerational learning, to pass down to the next. And so we're sort of seeing more, but there's still gaps. And I think what we need to see is a little bit more of those stories and those practices sort of platformed on, spaces like this or in books, and and have more access so folks that are interested can learn and understand.
Definitely.
I guess while we're talking about healing and health, one of my favorite studies, and I haven't read the whole thing, but I've this book is kind of like a Bible for me in a way. it's the Western A. Price. Are you familiar with Western A. Price dish? He basically...
No, I'm not. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. He basically traveled around the world and looked at Indigenous people and their health, and kind of just looked at them and followed them around. And this is a very butchered short story, but basically he came to this conclusion that in Australian Indigenous people were the finest. Like, they were the strongest, the most, robust, the healthiest. They had the healthiest teeth, jaw, like basically they were faultless. And he put it down to what they could eat, like that they were just living off the land, and the types of food that they ate was so supportive to them. And, they had no health issues, they're perfect jaws, and they obviously had the perfect diet. And so, which amazes me, because if we look around, that is not the case for us anymore. And so I know you're quite versed with, you're observing the climate and, really in that. And so I'd kind of just love to jam and explore on
because
knowing that. And
it goes from, living with the land, working with the land, living off, like being part of the land, more or less. And that's probably when, our like Mother Earth is healthiest. And now what we're seeing to stop, like in the name of climate and climate science, is getting further away from that with introducing more technologies and smart cities and climate lockdowns. So we'd be even further removed from land.
removing big things from our diet, like animal foods.
In replacement of created lab meats. So could you jam with us a little bit on that one?
Yeah, like what would it look like if...
I mean, where to start the jam, hey?
I mean, just a small question. If you could just,
Yeah.
If you put a great summarizing point there.
Nothing big or anything. But look, I think importantly is that, well, I think to start off with is that for a very long time, we have gotten to a place in our society that through certain, through certain systems, certain communities, we have come to a place where we're past turning points and thresholds, and where we're seeing a lot of our land be impacted and our oceans, but that has now impacting not just those vulnerable, but everyone. But it's that because we're not feeling it equally is the challenging barrier that we have. And I think, we need to learn a lesson from Mother Earth. And I know that seems like so...
Byron.
I guess. Yes, it does. But I think it's a reminder of taking away and using sort of language that is really colonial and settler, that has all been about, that has been led by not those that are First Nations and Indigenous, like climate action, crises, all of those sort of language, to sort of like the caring and the value of actually unlearning that and relearning, the ways of where we are right now. We were sort of like, we were put in institutions that only had a certain structure of education, instead of that of being a walking country, following and learning from elders, sitting down, that what especially First Nations people used to just sit around and listen, because we never had a written language. Everything was shared, spoken through word and through our paintings, through our songs, through our plants, through our lands, because it's shared through and kept on the history of everything. And that is like, we've conducted this social and ecological governance in ways that both sustain healthy relationships with country and healthy relationships with people. Because taking care of sacred resources means taking care of people, and not just for now, but for our grandchildren and their grandchildren, which also means in order to take care of their, the sacredness, the science, the humanness, the cultural knowledges and practices of this country. But, as we continue to see patriarchal systems that continue to be perpetuated in many forms, we still have, we're seeing not long-term and sustainable solutions, but short-term that they think that can still profit. And we need to understand that it's
that. What's a short term? Just so I can wrap my head around kind of what you're trying to say. What's a short term solution
the smart cities and lab meets.
Okay.
Yeah. So like smart cities or and that's just a mere opinion, because
I share that opinion.
Because smart cities aren't accessible for regional areas, but so or lab meat, or going shifting the way so that we can do this, or green energy. We need to shift away from this language and actually unlearn that and reconnect with where you are presently, to understand these real solutions are born from grassroots communities led by incredible leaders that know what's best for their community, know how to restore and integrate it back into what works well with their land, to shift away from it. And that also gives us, the First Nations people, the self-determination to make decisions about their country. And this comes back from Cultural Heritage Act, where we've got just archaic legislation that still continues to undermine us as people, that honestly puts, is a perpetuation of that barrier of human rights. And so if we can learn from that and unlearn from colonial constructs, we can create these communities that can be more robust, that can live off the land, that can be more meaningful, that can be more purposeful, but more sacred into what it can bring. But, these ongoing barriers of systems of oppression just continue to impact us, and especially women as well. And this is not just here, but in the across the globe. And, the changing climate continues as we continue to surpass those tipping points. We need to, the solutions are out there. It's just galvanizing them to do it.
What would some of those solutions look like? I'm really interested, because I feel like the solutions that we're being given currently just seem really like a Band-Aid and a corrupt kind of.
They actually seem
insane. It seems absolutely insane. There's no other word.
Yeah, like the solutions that we're being given actually are going to end up being more detrimental, because
they always
you've got to create a lot of technology which uses a lot of resources. It's just kind of perpetuating.
And like you said, the human rights issue, I don't think there's any regards to many humans anymore. But anyway,
I mean, I think for coming from sort of the stuff that I'm, how I'm supporting communities, is that Torres Strait Islander people, like my nation, is calling for sea levels, for seawalls. And you can see seawalls that are throughout different areas of around the coastlines of Australia are dependent on, obviously, how our currents work. That knowledge is obviously dependent on those that live by that land. And so as sea levels rising, right now there are sea levels rising, overfishing, inundation that are climate impacts that are really quite detrimental to our communities. And last year, and this is just going a little bit, but the Our Islands Are Home campaign saw 8 Torres Strait people take their voices to the Human Rights Committee and accuse the then Australian government, the Morrison government, for not reducing their emissions. And so I guess so coming back, so bear with me, is that Right now, Australia is leading in is number one and number two in exporting coal and gas, which is exacerbating our emissions globally, creating polar ecosystems like Antarctica and the Arctic Circle really vulnerable, which drives the biological and physical shifts of the ocean. My people are really dependent on eating and on the ocean because it not only te- uh, it helps us travel to and from islands. It provides us our medicine. It provides us our food and our resources. And so when our coral shifts are warming up, um, and it's shifting from ocean bleaching through the shifts of the oceans, my people are unable to catch fish. And so food security is a risk. But more importantly, or just as important, we're not able to practice our culture where we have a right to practice when we have practiced this for thousands of years. And so through this, when we took this case last year in September, the government actually found that they were guilty, and on a United Nations level are the first developed nation to be reprimanded to pay loss and damages. Right
That's
now we're coming
amazing.
up to a budget in May. And right now we see that there aren't funding. A solution that could be really help support my island communities is a seawall. But right now my family are using a forklift pallet with coconut husks and coconut leaves as the first barrier from sea levels rising, wherein I've had to pick up in the last 3 summers the bones of my grandparents because of that. And so, as we in this political landscape are going through what we've been hearing over the last couple of months, safeguard mechanisms of making sure we reduce our emissions, these are the things that we talk about. Um, what we can do that is sustainable, fair, maybe not long term, but until we sort of, until there's the barriers of, I guess, energy that's still in discussion and through other things. But, being able to do that, working with our people, working together so that we can continue to practice culture. You're working together with stakeholders to understand how that island shifts. We're able to remain on our islands and not be dispossessed and become climate refugees and not be at risk like, you know, leaders from other parties that are continuing to share deficit language and racial behavior right now, that we can be remain and still be. And these are the gaps that we face. And so when you look at it in that landscape, it's like, how then do you become and step into that? And what can you do more? And I guess it's that meaningful of what we brought in the beginning of this, of like acknowledgement to country, but I guess of like, that solutions of what you asked, Chloe.
Mm.
This is what it looks for. These are the solutions that are being led by people on the ground in community. They know that they need a seawall. They've been advocating. But for some reason, when we've got a budget coming up, we're not going to get that. And
Mm.
so who and out my community don't even contribute to an emission.
It's
And this is
so
where we
fucked up when
see
you
the
talk about it that
disproportionate
way.
impact of justice.
Mm.
And so for me, for intergenerational learning, how do I then pass down the next generation of learning? I want to share these stories with Will. I have her as I have like, my island home. I also have like Willow's sort of like sign that she drew for me. So she was like, please don't forget me. These are the things that I hope to, when I have children, I can share these on. But these are the things that are at risk. And sort of, I guess, bring it then into a local context where, where maybe you're both at is that, you've just gone through impacts of floods. You saw desecration of your lands, your rivers. And, there's a lot of First Nations people and communities still sort of bearing the brunt of sort of rebuilding. There are still non-Indigenous folks that are still bearing the brunt of rebuilding. And we still, and that's not obviously to bring in that in, but I guess that's that sort of like, we can learn from the lessons to be better. And they're there. We have a whole history of what not to do.
Mm.
and how we do it, we have those approaches, and we know that we have community that want to come together for that collective of, collaboration of just
Yeah.
change.
I've always thought that to make any good progress with any of these issues that we're kind of facing, especially climate, for me, I'm like, well, the only way to go forward is to go backwards. And it's actually to live in a completely different way that we're currently living. It's not to create new technology. It's not to create something to overcome the next thing whilst we continue to live the way we're living. And so something that really frustrates me is that the government actually has never spoken about doing, instead of, climate lockdowns, or we're going to ban meat, in which they're just pretty much doing in New York at the moment, and blaming every cow on the planet for the climate, which is obviously an over-exaggeration for story here. They've never said, we're going to go to Woolworths and Coles and we're going to strip it bare because we actually don't need 95% of the shit that's in this store. They're not doing that, obviously, because corporate greed. It's corruption. They've never said, instead of getting every single petrol diesel car off the road and replacing it with electric vehicles, because that's going to absolutely kill a whole other region of this planet and it's actually not sustainable, in my opinion, we're going to just do this instead. It's like there never seems to be a retraction. It's always continue living the way you're living and we'll come up with a solution. So I don't really know where I'm going with this, but it just seems frustrating. And I can actually see why people don't want to get on board with climate stuff, because it does seem like silly. It seems like, well, really, are you going to tell me I can't eat meat, even though Weston Price clearly did this phenomenal study proving that, Australian Indigenous people ate this way and they're literally the most incredible human beings on the earth, but I'm going to have to eat plastic. It just seems like we've got our blinkers on a little bit, and do you know what I mean?
I mean, you make a valid point. Exactly. It's like these multinational corporations that are a part of the system that's really, leading in this. And instead of taking accountability, and those that lead it and those government and political parties, they're just like, we'll have a sort of like a plan B, plan C that's not just as good, but because they just can't unlearn. And I understand transition, and I know that people may need that, but it's about this is where I guess, you're right. You can't just take off meat off it because people need it. People's blood types are different. People have choices, or have the right for their choices. But I guess it's and maybe this is, I guess, and you may disagree, but I guess there's climate solutions of those that are sort of, shifting the way they farm, shifting agricultural practices, having more alternative approaches, biodynamic. And, a big part of this has been I'm grateful for you, Keshia, because of your intense, for your passion and wanting to interrogate and unpack, really big issues of remember going on my journey and going through the research and understanding that. I feel like I am a better person in this and understanding of food because of you and understanding that, and really it sort of galvanized my wanting, I guess, thirst for knowledge for food sovereignty. It's about sort of shifting the way that, plastic, like you're right, plastic may not be the cause of the climate crisis, but it is a symptom. But there are communities that cannot afford, because of the cost of living right now, to go plastic free, to be able to minimize that out. And so you had some low-lying programs like the Red Cycle Loop that, could put your soft plastics into places where it could be distributed. And that was low-lying and a step into. But now, because of funding and, they've been they've been displaced and been sort of like shut down, and so it's like those that are still dependent, that don't have a choice, there aren't options for them, and it's not making it accessible, because as we shift, we know the expenses of this, and as we continue in this landscape of cost of living, it's through the decades and decades of sort of like, I guess, trying to push government and the greater audience of White Australia about jumping on board on, leaning into climate justice. This through COVID was a major disruption, because it exacerbated the use of plastic and single use.
Yeah.
And now those that may have ongoing barriers, it's still going to be a gap. And so there are things out there. It may be 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. But I think I think it's just the way that you approach and who you sort of like collaborate with, and being intentional and shifting the way that we did it from the past, and walking forward together, in relation, and strengthened and connected with those around you. I think, there's that for, there's a step into change and to shifting.
How would we connect to those grassroots kind of communities? Communities is not the right word, but like if we were like, all right, let's leave here today and I want to go and do something. Is it more like look at yourself in the mirror, look at where you're at, and that's our biggest step forward? And then second to that, how do we get involved as an ally that's actually doing something that's worthwhile?
Can I interject?
Yeah, sorry. I was actually trying to say 2 things at once then, and I got completely skewed.
No, I like where you're going with it. I feel like in the perfect world, for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tish, but it would be in our schools, they're taught how to forage, and they're taught about the native plants. What is native? What is not native? And that is an everyday thing that they learn. As much as they learn reading and writing, they're learning how to live off the land. Because if you can then change those future generations and take them away from needing a supermarket, and supermarkets just filled with plastic packaged foods, to now I can see a lily-pilly tree over there, and I can go grab A, B, and C, grab my bow.
Next year,
hunting.
You'll be able to say what those A, B, and C's are. We're on it. We're going to get on
We're
this.
learning. But if our kids are learning this at school, and which is part of Indigenous culture, which is part of the rich history of the Indigenous people who have lived here well before, white man stepped a foot on this place, then all of a sudden we're going to that's a massive shift. It's away from technology, but it's also away from using so much energy, which it's the energy that's the issue here. Needing to drive places, needing to go to supermarkets, where everything in a supermarket has had the highest carbon footprint ever. So anyway, that's my solution. I'm just going to advocate for that.
Yeah, I hear you. But it's kind of like, I feel like I wish we had more access to people speaking on this type of thing, as opposed to the government pushing down their corrupt BS on us. And all of us are just kind of like trying so hard to just, we don't want to hear it because it just seems dirty. We're just like, no, that's not how it's
not health
going to play out.
It's not health for people. Yeah. It's not health for our planet. It's not health for
and at this
the
point
environment.
There's not much trust left in the to be squeezed out from them. So it's kind of like, it'd be nice if we could find ways to connect with these grassroots movements and kind of
bring back some of those cultural
simplify,
needs.
go backwards a bit to go forward.
100%. And I mean, you completely said it. Like, it's these multinational corporations and governments that put it back on us, like as if it was our blame. Like, like the carbon calculator. It's like, and making as if it's responsibility. But I think that's where it's just like, I think it's community and people that have that power, because we've seen it before when, movements happen, change is there. And you're right. We need to keep, like, a part of this is not just like shifting, industries like agriculture. It's shifting, most important, especially in this country, big industries like the fossil fuel, and keeping all new coal, oil, and gas in the ground, because every fraction of a degree matters. Because it's the vast difference of, I guess, bringing, lived experiences. But I guess, as an advocate, like, it's the vast difference to climate justice, to climate action, where 1.5 degrees could mean a fighting end, could mean a fighting chance for my people, where 2 degrees could mean the fighting end. And so, we wield the weapons that can make us or sell us out, and we have to do it for each other, right? We have to do it for our people, for our humanity.
Oh, Tish, it's been so good chatting to you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, both of you, for having me here, and just, I think, sharing a lot and creating a really safe space to just, start, these. To start this conversation in your space, to create these conversations, and sort of, I guess, unpack more, and can't wait to just share more about those, grassroots groups as well, and sort of working how you both can connect and strengthen the road to wisdom with them.
Oh, thank you, love.
Thank you so much,
It's
Tish.
been fantastic. We'll have to get you on for another part so we can.
We
go
say that
deeper.
after we speak to everyone,
pretty much
because
everyone,
there's just not enough time. We could talk for hours.
There is not enough time.
This has been so good, and I've learnt a lot. So thank you.
Thanks, my love. Thanks for tuning in to the Road to Wisdom podcast. To join the journey, you can follow us on Instagram at theroadtowisdom.podcast and at www.theroadtowisdompodcast.com. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. We look forward to seeing you next week with more juicy content.